If you're on this webinar, you know that living in a Maharishi Vastu home promotes in reliable, measurable ways our physical and mental health, our family's harmony, our success, and even a more fulfilling life. All of these have been carefully documented so they're no longer a matter of belief. And if you practice transcendental meditation, as many of the listeners to this webinar do, you may know that Maharishi Vastu homes have an influence that is, well, parallel to the influence, the effect of meditating, in that it also promotes the alignment of our individual intelligence with cosmic intelligence, with that intelligence that organizes all of nature. And it does so through a series of highly integrated elements, which we'll go into very briefly as we see slides that illustrate them, but which include the effect of the directions that we're facing upon our activity, the influence of the directions that our houses face, where in the house certain key activities take place, the proportions and measurements of the home, the use of natural and non-toxic materials for maximum health, and effects from the site. These are only some of the elements of Vastu, but they're major ones, and we will briefly touch on them as we see slides. Well, how to afford a home. For many people, smaller is more achievable, and for some, very small is enough. And the tiny house movement is a descriptor for people who over the last 15 years or so have built very, very small houses. It commonly refers to houses that are less than about 600 square feet or 62 square meters. And some do this in order to save money, and others do it because they are committed to reducing their carbon footprint on planet Earth. Our guest speaker will go into them in just a minute, and I also at the end will be presenting to you some legal issues to keep in mind when you're building a tiny house. Well, let me ask you, how many of you would like to live in a tiny house? And why don't you give us a response by raising your hand? Okay, down on, if you really raise your hand, I won't see you, but if you do it on the button lower right, then we'll see yes. We're seeing 14 so far who have raised their hands, 20, 21, I'm sure there are many more. So a significant percentage of those of you who are on the call. And of you, how many of you have a desire to build a tiny house to use for some other purpose besides actually being a house, perhaps as an office, perhaps as a meditation space? Why don't you raise your hands? And I'm not getting any takers yet, but maybe we will after we show you some of these other uses of tiny houses. And so now I would like to introduce Wojtek, who is possibly the world's most experienced Maharishi Vastu architect. And he, in addition to building around Europe, has built in much of Asia, across Eastern Europe, in Russia, and especially in Nepal. And so he really is a Maharishi Vastu architect for the entire globe, and he has a great deal to share with us. And so welcome, Wojtek. And as soon as you ask, I'll start your slides.
Thank you for inviting me, and good afternoon to all Europeans. Good evening to all Europeans, and afternoon to those on American continents. This subject is very timely because, as John mentioned, many people would like to have a Vastu house, but building a big house seems to be, or sounds to be, a too difficult task, also economically and technically. So we want to encourage you or to show how Vastu can be created with less money and with by designing in a very efficient way the space you need so that you can build it anywhere. And let us see the slides now. So the theme is small and tiny Vastu homes. As John mentioned, by tiny we mean houses that are less than 70 or 60 square meters, or 700 or 600 square feet. And the small houses are maybe around 100 square meters. And many of them were also built or are being built. But we are talking about tiny houses which are built in harmony with natural law, which makes a big difference as compared to what is generally in the market. Because as you probably know, Vastu or Vedic architecture means putting life of the person, of the owner of the house or the family of the house in harmony with natural law. So let's go to the next slide, please. These are examples of non-Vastu houses, which could well be also Vastu houses, on the condition that they would be oriented properly and that they would have a Vastu fence and they would have Vedic measurements, and that functions in the room would be organized according to the movement of the sun. But the purpose of this slide is to show how different these tiny houses can be, or Vastu houses can look, and how trendy it is since last 15, 20 years to build these small houses. And the reason is the economy, of course, because the houses, the construction costs more and more, but also scarcity of land. There is not always enough land available for big houses. So some people prefer to build a small one and take it as a challenge to build it or to design it in an efficient way. And next one. This slide shows how important it is to connect the building with nature, to open it. And otherwise, we also recommend that the windows are big in Vastu houses, especially eastern windows, so that the energy and the light of rising sun is invited into the building. And next. Now we'll see a few examples from different countries of tiny Vastu houses. And this is from Bernard Jamois in France, in the village of Médard in South France. So it's a nice natural setting. And this is the same building seen from the east side. They have also on the other side of the street, there's another small house built according to Maharishi Vastu. So they started already, and some other people are interested to build also nearby to create a stronger effect of Vastu. And next. This is an example from South Africa. As you can see, it's a Vastu house. It has a Vastu fence around it. It has a pinnacle, this peak at the top of the roof. It has nice symmetry and eastern entrance. And this is a little cabin in mountains in New Zealand. A very small, probably the smallest Vastu house that has been built. And John has some story about this building. So let's hear from John.
The owner sell the house and move into town because of work, because this house is obviously in an isolated place. And the person who bought it, they went to visit once at the time of the sale, and he emerged from the house, and he was very gruff and rude to them, didn't want to have anything to do with them, and was smoking. And a year later, they came through this area, and they decided to stop in and see the owner again. They knocked on the door, and he was a completely different human being. He had stopped smoking, and he was very warm and sweet to them. And perhaps that transformation was the result of spending a year in a Maharishi Vastu tiny house. We'd certainly like to think that.
Yes, thank you. And this is an example from Denmark. Also a small Vastu house, about 20 square meters only, or 200 square feet. Most of them, as you see, are wooden houses. Next. This is an American example from Heavenly Mountains from North Carolina.
And it's about 880 square feet. This is one of the most popular houses in our portfolio and on our website. And people think that it's much larger than it is. The upper gable there on what appears to be a second story is actually just a loft. But John will show some pictures from the interior of that house in a little bit, but 880 square feet.
And that is really larger than technically a tiny house. But I will also point out that there's a screen porch, which we see on the right, which is included in that 880. And if you exclude it, which technically you should, then it's just under 800 square feet. Here's a view down from the loft. A view through the kitchen to a seating area. On the right, we see that screen porch. I think that's the last one. And this is the newest Maharishi Vastu house that is built. It was built here in Fairfield. It's actually for my next door neighbor. If I look out the window behind me, I can see this house. It's really charming. I've had a meal there and it feels terrific. And the very, very happy in it.
And it is 525 square feet.
Very good.
And the colors are Scandinavian.
Ah.
Yes, for some reason. And I'm speaking from Finland. So we have this color is very popular. My neighbor has this color of wooden house with this brownish or reddish traditional wall and then white framing around it.
It's a beautiful color combination. This is one of the first tiny houses built in the US. As it is completed, it's maybe a little larger than a tiny house. It consists of one building, which is in the foreground, and there's a little tiny annex in the back. You can see 3 windows on the far left. What the owner did is he made in the annex the kitchen facilities and the bathroom facilities so that the main wing of the building, which we see in the foreground, inside is a single room with a gabled ceiling, a cathedral ceiling, which is commonly done in tiny houses and which makes them feel larger. This house, this room feels very, very spacious. We can see that the owner is a musician in the photo on the left. He even has a full grand piano in the house. And on the right, a smaller instrument, a sitar.
Actually, John, the main part of that house is just a little under 300 square feet.
Wow. So this really is a tiny house.
Yes.
And I think he's been living in it for almost 20 years.
Yes.
This is another Fairfield house, and I'm going to share with you a quote by the builder, the woman who had it built and who lives in it. She wrote, "The Vastu cabin is so sweet. The feeling is amazingly powerful yet subtle. Wholeness, bliss, deep peace. The feeling of inner contentment is so strong and power and wonderful, and sleep was like in the arms of mother." And this raises a really important point to make about a tiny house, which is that what we seek in a new house is usually some fulfillment of our desires or aspirations. And we often think that if we build a bigger house with more features, it's more likely to bring us that fulfillment. But when we build according to the laws of nature with all of the elements of Vastu as we are seeing in these houses, including, for instance, the fence with an opening to the east, what we find is that the alignment of this house with our own inner nature brings us great inner fulfillment, no matter how small it may be. And so people who build a smaller house, a Vastu house, than they thought they were aspiring to, report to us that it is still completely fulfilling for them. Here's one photo of the interior of this house and a couple more.
And this house, John, is just around 350 square feet.
Fabulous. And it has a loft for sleeping with a ladder to it. We'll talk about that again, that you often see in tiny houses. Here's one more in Maharishi Vedic City.
And this one is around 550 square feet on the first floor. Probably the loft area, which is under the deep pitched roof, is probably around 200 square feet.
And here's one in Abundance Eco Village, the completely off the grid community built just north of Maharishi Vedic City. This that we designed, even though it's quite small. And Susan, do you have its square footage handy?
Yes, the interesting thing about this house, John, is that it's very similar in its size to the one in North Carolina, the mountains of North Carolina. It is 880 square feet. And the other interesting thing is that this one is occupied by the same lady who built the house in North Carolina. So she moved from one tiny house to another.
One of the panelists has just asked, it would be helpful if we can mention in square meters instead of only square feet. Yes, we certainly should do that. And if we fail to, just move the digits over one place. So 880 square feet is about 90 square meters. And this is a tiny house that was built by a new graduate from Maharishi University of Management and his father. They built it together to start a business building tiny houses. On the left, we see it as it was just produced by them. And on the right, we see it as it was installed and now occupied.
John, this one is around 220 square feet or around 23 square meters. And it was built entirely in a warehouse and then moved on a trailer because it would fit on a trailer, and then placed on a foundation.
And now we would like to introduce Ruth Ann Taves. She is actually Susan's equivalent for Canada. She is the Maharishi Vastu administrator for the nation of Canada. Ruth Ann, would you like to tell us about your own experiences building and living in a Maharishi Vastu house? And maybe after you start talking, we'll share the screen again and we'll show some photos of your beautiful home.
Thanks very much, John. Yes, I'd be happy to share some of our experiences. My husband and I, 10 years ago, moved into our Maharishi Vastu home here on Salt Spring Island. The journey started with the idea of, yes, we want to build a Vastu home, very much a priority for us. And we originally thought it would be something like a 2,400 square foot home. But when we started preparing the budget, we realized we weren't quite going to be able to match that. So we decided that let's see what happens if we think about building a smaller place. We had already been living in various apartments that were much smaller in Europe and in Canada, and we thought, I think we can make it work to live in a smaller house. So we worked on the design for this, and we came up with an 830 square foot house which has fulfilled our needs very, very well. Here you can see the outside of it. In the upper right, there's a photo of the surveyor out front marking the locations for the Vastu fence. So you can see it as it was being constructed. And then the central picture shows after we've put our gardens in and have been living in it for a while. As John mentioned, there are a number of issues that were very important in our design. One was to have plenty of light in the house. So we have large windows all around the house. And we have a cathedral ceiling with a skylight above. For us, the kitchen was very important. And so we have what we would call a full-size kitchen, lots of cupboard space, a good-sized stove. And you can see there that the cook would be facing east, facing nature when they're cooking. So one of the very important parts is to have that connection with nature. We also have gardens on all four sides of our house to help with that connection with nature. So the inner beauty and the outer beauty are very much the same. And if you go to that other slide that you just went past with the kitchen, on the right there, you can see a glimpse of our living room area just before we were getting ready to move in. That's my husband kneeling down in front of our wood stove, which is our main use of heating. We also have hot water radiators. You can see the one in the far distance and one just a bit on the left. We prefer that quiet and natural energy of hot water radiation for our heat, and that serves as a backup if our wood stove is not functioning, or if we're away, then the radiators will give us a moderate bit of heat. And on the left, you can just see the doorway into the bathroom. In our bathroom, we have a full bathtub, a separate shower, and a washer and dryer. So our house has been very comfortable for us. It has everything that we need for the two of us to be very, very happy. Now, one of the cons, you might say, about living in a small house is there is only one bedroom. There is no place for guests to come and stay. But we also find that can be an advantage because a lot of people want to come to Salt Spring Island to visit. So we're not inundated with visitors. They can stay at a local B&B, but they don't have to stay in our house. Also, with two people in a tiny space, sometimes it's advantageous to have an external building that as an alternate spot for someone to go. So we do have an office space, an office building outside the Vastu fence where we can go and have some of our exercise equipment as well as some office equipment there. There's also not much space in a small house for clutter. So we don't have time or space to be able to pile up a lot of clutter. And the plus side of that, the flip side, is that it's easier to clean. Very much does not take time to clean up and make it look spick and span again. You can see at the top too, by the way, that we have a ceiling fan in the living room that helps with circulation of air. And being on the West Coast here, we have our windows open. We don't have air conditioning, although with global warming, we're never quite sure if we're going to manage, but opening the windows and having the fresh air come through is a very vital part and very important part of our home. So I would reflect what others have said, that the level of inner contentment and peace in this home is just amazing. And it has been the best home that I have ever lived in. And during my lifetime, I have had built from the beginning 2 other homes as well. I've had my hand involved in designing and moving into different homes. And this is by far the best, the most peaceful, the most contented and happiest that we have been. So that's my little summary of our experience in the Vastu home.
Thank you so much, Ruth Ann, and I hope that you'll stay on with us because as questions come in, I have no doubt that some of them will be for you. And so I'm going to now show very briefly another possible use of tiny homes that some people make use of, which is as offices or as meditation spaces. This is one that Wojtek sent to me. And do you have any comments about this, Wojtek?
Yes, this was built in Sweden about 10 years ago, after Maharishi has encouraged people who thought they cannot afford to build a Vastu house, and he was urging everybody to live in Vastu and have life in accordance with laws of nature. So he said, if you cannot build a Vastu house, why don't you build a pavilion or garden house in your garden where you already live, outside of your main building? And this is exactly the case. You can see this dark brown rectangle is the existing building, which is not oriented properly. And then the owner has built this pavilion of 15 square meters, which is about 150 square feet. There is no bathroom and no kitchen there, so it's very simple structure to build, just 4 walls. And it can be used in summer. If you want to use it in winter, then some heating system should be there. And you can also see from the picture on the right side that it is important in such case to have a living room outside, which means a terrace or porch, to be outside, to spend some time outside of such small building. And this applies, of course, to any tiny house. And this is another example of the same concept. A garden house outside of the main building in Switzerland, just outside of Geneva. And you can see also Vastu fences around, but I don't see any porch here. The whole garden probably serves as that purpose.
I designed a Maharishi Vastu house in Hawaii, and for the owner, in addition to the house, they also asked me to design a garden pavilion, which would have some additional functions in it. And so this is the pavilion that I designed for them. And it's, I believe, a music studio.
With a beautiful Vastu fence around.
Oh, yes. Yes, used of locally quarried volcanic stone in Hawaii. And this is a rendering of a pavilion that I designed for an American who has a home in a Renaissance community in Italy. His home is just outside of the city, but it's within the historic district. So he was not permitted to build a Maharishi Vastu house anywhere on any lot surrounding that city. So in the backyard of his historic house, he asked me to design a pavilion so he could spend time working, meditating, sometimes even sleeping in Maharishi Vastu. Well, one of my favorite Renaissance buildings is located in this historic town, a chapel. And so I designed for him a pavilion which was based very carefully on the historic Renaissance chapel. And now let us go back to Wojtek. And shall I keep the screen share on for your next part?
Yes, okay. Thank you. So here we have a summary of what you need to consider if you want to build a small Vastu house for permanent living. You would need insulated outer walls, also in hot climates to insulate against heat. You will of course need a foundation. You will need some kitchenettes, a small kitchen. You will need a bathroom. And of course, doors and windows will be needed for any size of the house. And utility connections, water, electricity, sewage system, and so on. Heating system, some laundry, if not laundry, just washing machine somewhere. Then storage space you have to consider. You need to have a Vastu fence around it for protecting from negative outer influences. And then it's good to have some garden and some storage for garden and for garden produce. And of course, you need a building land to create such project. So these are the minimum requirements for fully all year around use of Vastu house. And next, yes. This picture illustrates the meaning of outer wall in the floor plan according to the climatic condition. So in cold climate, if you have a wall, for example, around 42 centimeters thick, how much less space you have inside as compared to hot climate with say 15 centimeters thick wall. So in both cases, the floor plan is the same and the outer measurements of the building are the same. So you have 26 square meters in this example, in both cases, as a footprint, the outer measurement, including walls. But on the left side, you have only 17 square meters of usable floor area. And on the right side, you have usable floor area of 23 square meters. So it makes a big difference. So the larger is the building, the better is the proportion between outer walls and the usable space. And this is an example of a 35 square meter mini house, which was designed and built in Belgium about 15 years ago. And the idea here is, so it's 6 by 6, a bit less than 6 by 6 meters, 20 by 20 feet. And the idea is that there is one space, but there is a corner for a kitchen, and there is a loft for sleeping. There is a bathroom in the corner, a small bathroom with shower and everything, and then a living room. And then let us see other drawings and examples of these. Next slide. These are facades of the same building. And on the left side, they are without porch. On the right side, they have big porch. So there are two versions of the same building. And next, this is an example of a Vastu house, 8.5 by 8.5 square meters. Meters, which makes about 70 square meters. But they added another floor, so they went even over 100. This was built in Ukraine, and they are creating a little village or peace colony of tiny houses. The other houses are these 35 square meters, which I showed a moment ago. And next. Here is a section of these 35 square meters. So you can see that you can even stand on in the loft where the sleeping area is. And next. This is a house in Russia, 8.5 by 9 meters, about 74 square meters altogether, plus attic or loft, also based on a similar plan. This is almost completed. And here is a concept developed by a builder, meditating builder, who is very much interested in Vastu, Alan Christiansen. Only 25 square meters. The idea is that it will be produced under a roof in a factory and then transported. But the main thought is shown in the next slide. See, later you can add 2 rooms, one on the south side, one on the north side as a wing. Of course, you can add a porch in the east side, but it gives a flexibility. If you don't have funds for a big house, you can build smaller one and then extend later, expand.
Actually, Wojtek, one of the questions that came in through the chat, and I'm sure this is consideration for a number of people, is the houses that are for people who are aging in place and who could not use a loft as a sleeping area.
Yes.
But this is an excellent alternative to that.
That's right.
And this layout, coincidentally, Wojtek, has actually been built in Fairfield. It looks precisely like this.
Was it also done in phases?
It was all done at once. It wasn't
yeah.
actually completely built in a factory, but it was built, each of the walls were built as panels in a factory. And so even the conception was quite similar. And it's a really beautiful house.
And here is a slide. It came a bit late, but these are the drawings of the 15 square meters garden pavilion in Sweden. So that's how it looks like. See, there's one space in the floor plan, one space only, with 4 windows on each side and or 5 windows and the entrance door. And this is another project in Sweden, started by an architect. And the idea here is these are summer houses or summer cottages. And the idea here was to create for a group of friends 3 different houses, but in one Vastu fence, in one Vastu square. And for this, we connected them in a U shape, which is one of Vastu configuration towards east. And it has a common roof or porch you see inside around the courtyard, so that, yes, you enter from the east under the roof, and then once you are under the roof, then you can enter from any direction, the buildings themselves. But it also creates some kind of unity or community or common space, bringing people together.
And it's a good way for utilizing land. Get
Yes.
three houses on one lot.
Yes, thank you. And also, let's go back for a second. It also makes it easier for utility connections, because then you share them. And I just wanted to mention that the middle building is already built. The others are still under construction. Next. And this is a project, this wasn't built yet, but it was also a garden house of only 19 square meters, which is about 200 square feet. to be built in Denmark. And the principle is the same, that there is a loft for sleeping, and then other functions are downstairs. This is a house built in Greece, 8 by 8, 8.5 by 8.5, which makes 65 or 70 square meters. And it has a nice big porch in front. And you can see that the same design can be done in different style according to the local tradition or local taste. Now, advantages and challenges of Vastu houses, and Ruth has mentioned some of them already. Advantages are that you have own Vastu house where you can live and enjoy the effect of Vastu without big expenses. In many cases, building permit is not needed, or it is simplified. John will tell more about it. And lower total cost, of course. Independence in the project. When you build just one individual house, you can build it more quickly, and there is more freedom to design according to your need. And also possible mobility. As we have mentioned earlier, some of these houses, if they are not wider than 10, 15 feet, they can be put on track and transported to another place if needed, or produced in a factory and then brought to the place where we want to have it. And then challenges or disadvantages. The cost per square meter or square foot will be higher, because for a small house, you still need a kitchen, you still need a bathroom, you still need utility connections, and so on and so on. Of course, the living space is limited. That's why it's important that the windows are large and that there is a nice porch in front, that you can spend time outside, have an extension of your living room outside. Utility connections will cost as much as for a big house. Proportion of walls to usable floor area in colder climate, when you have thicker walls, then it's not very economical, as I was showing in the earlier slide. You have to make sure that there is enough space for doing yoga asanas, if you do yoga asanas. And then storing space might be a challenge. Then you would have to reserve some space in the attics or outside of Vastu. And next. We always encourage, if possible, whenever possible, to build Vastu communities. We call them peace colonies because they create an stronger effect of peace, as compared to one single house standing alone. And similarly, as meditating in groups create an indivisible effect of coherence and peace, the same way Vastu houses, when there is a group of Vastu houses, the effect is stronger, not only on each other, but also on the surrounding environment.
This is terrific, Wojtek. It's a wonderful summary and an overview of all of our considerations. I'm now going to address one final subject before we turn to questions, and that is, what are the regulations that we have to be aware of when we are building a tiny Vastu house? Well, they differ, of course, in different parts of the world. Most of our audience, I think, is in the US, and that's the jurisdiction that I'm most familiar with. So I'm just going to speak about some of the US considerations, but these are often true in other countries. First of all, there are two kinds of tiny houses. One is ones that are on a permanent foundation, and the second are those that are on a chassis which has wheels permanently attached or which can have wheels attached. And we have in English the term recreational vehicle or RV. And some tiny homes may be built in the legal category of being an RV and others as a house. So first, let's look at the house category. If it's a house, that is, if it's on a permanent real foundation, then it has to be built under a particular building code. In the US, it's called the International Residential Code. It has a few requirements, and these requirements are actually set by the state and the city. So the things I say are not always enforced for you, but often they are. There's a minimum width of a room and a minimum ceiling height. Both are 7 feet 0. Maybe Wojtek can figure out what that is in meters, but of course this
It will be around 220, 2 meter 20 centimeters.
and probably you'll be doing that anyway. These are very small dimensions. There are also minimum clearances required for sink, toilet, and shower, but they're fairly minimal and you'll probably be meeting them. Next, we have seen some tiny houses with lofts, which are accessed usually by a staircase or by a ladder or by a very steep staircase. I want to tell you that such access to a sleeping quarters is normally illegal in the United States. In some jurisdictions, it is legal, including here, which is why you've seen so many photographs from our area. But nationwide, you often cannot do it. And so that may mean that your house will have a little larger footprint, but in fact, that also means that as you age, as you're no longer safe or comfortable using a ladder, you can still fully use your house. And I will describe that if you have ever spent time in a studio apartment, a one-room apartment plus bathroom, those are often about 400 or 450 square feet, which come to 45 or 50 square meters. And people live their entire lives in those. And so you can envision a single-story tiny house of that size. Yeah, again, if you have a loft, the code requires that in the event of a fire, a person be able to leave the loft through a window, and that window has to have certain minimum dimensions. And finally, the administrators of the building code in your region, your building code officials and your city council, lobby them to permit tiny houses if they do not right now. This is something that I did in Fairfield, Iowa. I made a formal presentation to them, and in conclusion, they concluded that they would now be very open to permitting tiny houses to be built. So you really can make a difference. And that is also because one point I didn't put on here is that building codes often have a minimum house size. And in the US, it's often around 600 square feet, sometimes even larger. And if you want to build a smaller house than that, then you either have to get the code changed or you may be able to build it in the backyard of an existing house. And then it becomes something called an accessory dwelling unit, which many jurisdictions permit. If it's an RV, the construction fees are cheaper. You have much simpler code requirements and fewer restrictions, but you have to figure out what's going to be your access to electric power, to water, to a sewer, and where can you keep it long is where you can park an RV. You can't park it indefinitely. The solutions are often mobile home parks, but those may not appeal to many of you. And another one is that in different parts of the US and around the world, there are now tiny home communities that you can rent or buy space in. Finally, in the backyard of a friend. Last, I want to mention that in the US, there's a particular kind of RV, which is called a park model home. These are even smaller. And we have designed several, and we have a couple of manufacturers that we know about in the Midwest who are able to build park model homes. They come on wheels, but we have 2 manufacturers that will build the walls completely out of logs, out of solid wood. And so it becomes a more natural house than in many cases. Back to you, Wojtek, for our conclusion.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. So the conclusion is we encourage you strongly to build Vastu if you are still not living in a Vastu house, and to experience yourself the effect. As it was mentioned earlier, the real value of Vastu is invisible. That means that the power of Vastu is something more than just what you see with your eyes as a structure. Tiny houses are more practical in warm climate. We're talking about it because it allows you to live outside and to extend your living room. That's why large terraces are recommended. Also large windows, especially on the east side. Natural, beautiful surrounding is an important factor. And then tiny houses behind an existing larger house. That was, we were talking about what Maharishi has recommended. Cost per square foot or per square meter, find out what it will be, because it will be higher than for a big building. And here an important point to understand is that in a tiny house you need a kitchen and utilities and bathroom anyway. And when you enlarge your house by a few square meters, you add an inexpensive, almost for free, extra square meters, because you don't need more bathrooms or more kitchen or more utility connections, or even outer wall and roof and foundation. It's all there, and for very little money you get extra empty square meters. I hope you understand what I mean by that. And then building code and zoning is of course important to consider. You have to find out before you start building, and then consider building together with others and to create a community. And the most important final advice, make your intention or resolution that you really want to build, make the step. And there is a saying, do we have one more slide?
I think that was the last one, actually.
Okay, so there is an old English saying or proverb, for those who start to weave, divine sends the thread. That means once you commit yourself to do something, to create something good, then nature will support you and will provide you either with finances or with other help, so that you can go ahead and you can do it. In Vedic tradition, it's called Sankalp. And there is also a proverb or saying in Vedic tradition that if you favor natural law favors you. If you do something to promote natural law, then you will be supported, you will be helped.
Thank you very much, Wojtek. This was very, very complete. And now we'd like to turn it back over to Celia and Susan, who have some questions for us from you, the audience.
Thank you, John. We received a question a couple of days ago. It says, I attended the webinar on Tuesday and wonder if an open one-room floor plan, say between 450 and 600 square feet, with solid or fabric movable room dividers would still be compatible with Vastu. I thought room dividers or curtains would be a way to adjust the space, but perhaps there are more important considerations about placement or measurements?
Some of this certainly can be done. We would work it out with you in a consultation for your own home.
Does a garden building need to have a fence?
Wojtek?
Yes, if you live there, if you use the building, for garages you don't have because cars are using it. But if people use the building, then Vastu fence is recommended because it creates protection from outer disturbances. And in our examples that we were showing, most of the buildings had Vastu fence.
Celia, maybe this question that came in through the Q&A, can you comment on the differences in cost and house density between modern subdivision construction and marble peace colony construction? I think, Wojtek, this person was referring to the example that you showed that had labeled it as a marble peace colony construction.
Yes. Of course, when you develop a peace colony or community of Vastu buildings, then the land cost will be much less and utility network and connections will be less, and designing process will be less because there will be some models that we will be applying. But still, it depends on the construction costs in the area, and it depends on the technology. For example, log houses will be more expensive than light timber structure, Canadian or American system. Brick will cost differently and so on.
Have some experience in the US of building tiny houses of conventional construction, but with natural materials for perhaps $300 a square foot or in the 300s. As everybody knows, construction costs are very fluid right now, so we don't know whether those numbers are still true today.
John, you also might mention the thing that came up on Tuesday, which is that people wanting to build a tiny house can actually defray some of the costs by, if they have the expertise, doing some of the building themselves.
That's a great point. In many of the houses that we saw, the owners did much of the labor themselves. And that's because in a house as small as this, a lower skill set is needed in some of the trades for the construction. Almost anybody can be taught how to install their floors, for instance. And in many cases, they can install their exterior cladding, perhaps not if it's brick, but if it's some kind of siding, et cetera, et cetera. And if one is adventurous and has some technical background, the job is small enough that you can do it. My wife built a Maharishi Vastu workshop on our property. She had a family construction weekend where her father and her best friend and another friend and the friend's son and I and she spent 3 days, and we got her 16-foot by 16-foot studio mostly erected, and then she finished all the rest of it herself. So this is a great way to save money.
Actually, there's another 400 square foot office meditation space that's being built right now in upstate New York, where the man who'd had some experience building, but he had people come in, they were actually Amish, to do framing of the house and put on the exterior cladding, and then he is just taking it from there. So it's a very good way and to bring down the cost. John, I think it would also be good to clarify one issue, because this actually came in as a question. The person says, I missed the first 15 minutes. Can you build a tiny house as an RV or on wheels or mobile? Or, is it always mobile?
It can be. This can be done. And the ideal Maharishi Vastu house is on a proper foundation and doesn't have a void under it. And this can be done in many cases with tiny houses. But we have some flexibility in really small ones, and they sometimes are built on chassis with wheels, either temporarily or permanently. Wojtek, do you have anything to add to that?
Vastu fence around
Very good.
with, yes, with proper Vedic dimensions.
And the foundation and the plinth.
Then the foundation would be probably, and plinth would be a light structure. Actually, at Meru in Holland, we have buildings that were transported from US, which have this plinth build afterwards with some light cement fiber boards.
Yes, and I have seen that done also here in the US, but they are then established in that location.
All right, I think we can close it for today. That was a fascinating look at tiny houses and how they can be used in a variety of situations. Thank you for your interest in Maharishi Vastu architecture, which enhances peace and happiness in life. Goodbye for now.